The research station floated like a giant metal flower in the black space above Kepler 442b. Its silver petals stretched out in all directions, each one bigger than most Earth cities. Ships from hundreds of different worlds docked at the station's many ports. Some ships looked like crystal spears, others like flowing water frozen in time, and a few resembled giant mechanical insects. Dr. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the Earth transport shuttle. He had never seen so many alien ships in one place before. His hands shook a little as he watched them. Jake was a smart man who worked with numbers and equations that most people could not understand. But right now he felt very small. "First time seeing the Grand Assembly?" asked Captain Amy Foster from the pilot's seat. She had been flying between Earth and other worlds for 10 years now. To her, this was just another day at work. "Yeah," Jake said quietly. "I still can't believe they asked for me specifically," Amy laughed. "Well, you did solve that quantum problem that had been stumping our best scientists for 20 years. And you did it in 3 days. Jake remembered that problem. It had seemed impossible at first. But then he started thinking about it differently. Instead of trying to solve it the way everyone expected, he approached it like a puzzle his daughter Emma used to play with. Sometimes the hardest problems needed the simplest solutions. Their shuttle docked at Port 7. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and Jake got his first smell of the station's air. It was clean but strange, with hints of something that reminded him of flowers and metal at the same time. Ambassador Lyra Chen waited for them in the docking bay. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had been Earth's voice in galactic politics for 5 years now. "Dr. Morrison," she said, shaking his hand, "welcome to Research Station Omega. I hope you're ready for this." "As ready as I can be," Jake replied, "though I still don't understand why they specifically wanted a human to look at this thing." Lyra's expression grew serious. "Because every other species in the galaxy has tried to solve it and failed. The Galactic Council is running out of options." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were made of some kind of white material that glowed softly. Other beings walked past them, some tall and thin like walking trees, others short and round, and a few that seemed to be made of living crystal that sang quietly as they moved. "How long has this puzzle been around?" Jake asked. 2,347 years, Lyra replied. "They found it in the ruins of a civilization called the Velthrons. No one knows what happened to them, but they left this one artifact behind. They entered a large elevator that moved sideways as much as it moved up." Jake's stomach did a small flip as they traveled through the station's strange geometry. Finally, the elevator stopped, and the doors opened to reveal the most amazing room Jake had ever seen. The research chamber was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into shadows high above, and the floor was made of the same glowing white material as the corridors. But what took Jake's breath away was what floated in the center of the room. The Velthran Codex hung in the air like a 3-dimensional puzzle made of light and energy. It was about the size of a small house, but it seemed to fold in on itself, in ways that hurt to look at directly. Streams of golden light flowed through complex patterns connecting nodes of brilliant blue energy. Mathematical symbols from hundreds of different cultures floated around it like a cloud of glowing insects. Around the codex, beings from across the galaxy worked at stations filled with computers and instruments that Jake didn't recognize. He saw the tall, graceful Zephyrians with their 6 arms moving in perfect coordination as they manipulated holographic displays. The Nethek collective representatives stood in perfect circles, their crystal bodies pulsing with shared thoughts as they calculated together. "My God," Jake whispered. "It's beautiful. And completely impossible to solve," said a voice behind them. Jake turned to see a being that looked like it was made of flowing silver water. "I am Coordinator Flux 7 of the Centauri Empire. We have been working on this puzzle for 600 years. Our greatest machine minds have declared it unsolvable." "Nothing is unsolvable," Jake said automatically. It was something he always told his students back on Earth. Flux 7's form rippled, which Jake guessed was the equivalent of laughter. Spoken like someone who has not yet tried to solve it. The codex contains over 14 billion separate calculations, each connected to thousands of others. The mathematical complexity grows exponentially with each layer you try to solve. Lyra led Jake closer to the codex. Up close, he could feel a strange humming in the air, like standing next to a massive generator. The patterns were even more complex than they had looked from across the room. Every time he thought he saw a pattern, it would shift and become something else. "What exactly is it supposed to do?" Jake asked. "We believe it contains the secret to faster-than-light travel without the side effects," Lyra explained. "Right. Now our FTL drives cause problems. They damage space itself over time, create dangerous energy fields, and can only be used for short periods. If we could understand what the Valthrons discovered, we could solve those problems." Jake nodded slowly. Every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy had the same problem. They could travel faster than light, but it came with costs that were getting harder to ignore. Some sectors of space had been damaged so badly by FTL travel that ships couldn't use their drives there anymore. The Zephyrians tried using their ability to see through time, Lyra continued. They looked at millions of possible futures where the puzzle was solved, but none of them showed how to actually do it. The Nethic Collective combined the intelligence of their entire species for 400 years. Even the old civilizations like the Alterans, who have existed for millions of years, gave up after centuries of trying. Jake walked around the codex, looking at it from different angles. The other researchers watched him curiously. He could feel their attention like physical weight on his shoulders. Most of them had been working on this problem longer than humans had been traveling in space. "Has anyone tried anything other than mathematical approaches?" Jake asked. Flux 7's form shifted again. "What else would there be? This is clearly a mathematical construct." "Maybe," Jake said quietly. "But what if it's not?" As Jake stood there watching the patterns flow and shift within the codex, he began to think about Emma's old puzzle boxes. Some of them had looked incredibly complex on the outside, covered with gears and symbols and moving parts. But the solution was always simpler than it appeared. Sometimes you just had to find the right place to push. He pulled out a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. The alien researchers watched in fascination as he began to sketch the patterns he saw, using the most primitive tools imaginable in a room filled with technology beyond Earth's understanding. The galaxy's greatest puzzle waited as it had for over 2,000 years for someone to solve it. Jake had been staring at the codex for 3 days now. While the alien scientists ran their complex computer programs and shared their collective thoughts, he sat in a simple chair with his notebook and pencil, drawing pictures. The other researchers found this fascinating in the way that people find strange animals at a zoo fascinating. They would stop their important work to watch the human with his primitive tools, then shake their heads or make their species equivalent of confused sounds before going back to their calculations. "The human continues to make marks on processed plant matter," observed High Calculator Vorth 9 ascending of the Zephyrians. His voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "This behavior serves no computational purpose that we can identify." "Perhaps it is some form of meditation ritual," suggested Crystal Singer Harmonic Resonance from the Nethic Collective. Her body pulsed with soft blue light as she shared this thought with her connected minds across the galaxy. "Many primitive species have such practices." Jake ignored their comments. He had learned long ago that being underestimated could be an advantage. While they saw primitive behavior, he saw something different. He was mapping the codex not as a mathematical equation, but as a physical object. In his notebook, he had drawn the same pattern over and over from different angles. Each drawing was simple, just lines and circles and arrows showing how energy flowed through the structure. But after 3 days of watching and drawing, he was beginning to see something that the others had missed. "Mind if I join you?" Jake looked up to see Dr. Elena Rodriguez approaching with 2 cups of coffee. She was the expedition xenobiologist, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and curious eyes that seemed to notice everything. "Thanks," Jake said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I didn't realize they had coffee on the station." "They don't," Elena replied with a grin. "I brought my own supply and convinced the food processors to make it. Some things are too important to leave to chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the patterns flow through the codex. Elena was one of the few people who didn't think Jake's simple approach was crazy. She understood that sometimes the best way to understand something complex was to step back and look at the big picture. "What do you see when you look at it?" Elena asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, then pointed to a section of his drawings. "You know what this reminds me of? Emma's puzzle boxes. Remember I told you about those?" Elena nodded. Jake had mentioned his daughter several times during their long journey to the station. Emma was grown up now, working as an engineer on Mars, but Jake still talked about her childhood with the pride of a loving father. "She had this one puzzle box that looked incredibly complicated," Jake continued. "It had gears and symbols and all these moving parts. I spent hours trying to solve it, thinking I had to understand every gear and every symbol. But Emma solved it in 5 minutes." "How?" "She ignored all the complex stuff on the surface and found the one simple mechanism underneath that controlled everything else. One small switch that unlocked the whole thing." Elena looked from Jake's drawings to the codex floating in the center of the room. "You think this is the same kind of thing?" "Maybe. Look at this pattern here." Jake pointed to his sketch. "Everyone sees this as part of the mathematical structure. But what if it's not? What if it's more like the mechanism in Emma's puzzle box, something that controls the other parts instead of being controlled by them?" Across the room, a group of Alterran scholars were discussing the codex in their musical language. The Alterrans were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, and their mathematics were so advanced that most other species couldn't even understand them. They had been working on the codex for longer than human civilization had existed. "The quantum probability matrices continue to shift in nonlinear patterns," sang Elder Melodious Truthseeker. "Each attempted solution creates new variables that increase complexity rather than reducing it. Perhaps we should approach from the temporal mathematics angle again," suggested another Alterran. "If we could isolate the time-dependent variables." Jake listened to their discussion with interest, but he noticed something they didn't seem to consider. They were all trying to solve the puzzle by making it more complex, not less. Every species here was incredibly advanced with technology and mathematics that made Earth's greatest achievements look like children's toys. But maybe that was the problem. "Elena," Jake said quietly, "what if the Veilthrans weren't as advanced as everyone thinks?" "What do you mean?" "Look around this room. Every species here can do things we can't even imagine. They can see through time, share thoughts across the galaxy, manipulate matter at the atomic level. But what if the Veilthrans were more like us? What if they were smart but not super advanced?" Elena considered this. "You're saying the puzzle might not be as complex as everyone assumes?" "Exactly. What if it just looks complex because it's designed to look that way?" Emma's puzzle box looked complex too, but the actual solution was simple. Jake flipped through his notebook, showing Elena the patterns he had been tracking. "Look at this. Everyone sees mathematical equations, but what if these are actually instructions? Not calculations to solve, but steps to follow? Like a recipe? Or assembly instructions? You know how some furniture comes with those confusing instruction books? They look complicated, but if you just follow the steps in order, it's actually pretty simple." Elena laughed quietly. "You're suggesting that the galaxy's greatest mystery is basically IKEA furniture instructions? Stranger things have happened." Their conversation was interrupted by an alert chime that echoed through the research chamber. The night shift was beginning, which meant most of the researchers would be leaving soon. The station never stopped working. Different species had different sleep cycles, so there was always someone working on the codex. As the day shift researchers began to pack up their equipment, Jake noticed something interesting. The codex's patterns looked different when there were fewer people around. The energy flows seemed calmer, less chaotic. "Elena, do you think the codex responds to the number of people looking at it?" "It's possible. Some quantum systems are sensitive to observation." "Why?" Jake stood up and stretched. His back was stiff from sitting in the same position for hours. "I want to try something tonight, when it's quieter. Will you stay with me?" "Sure. What are you planning to do?" Jake looked at the codex, then down at his simple drawings. After 3 days of observation, he was starting to see the underlying structure. It wasn't as random as it appeared. There were patterns within patterns, but they weren't mathematical patterns. They were mechanical ones. "I'm going to treat it like one of Emma's puzzle boxes," he said. "I'm going to stop trying to solve it and start trying to unlock it." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What's the difference?" Jake smiled. "With a puzzle, you figure out the answer through logic and calculation. With a lock, you just need to find the right key and turn it in the right direction." As the research chamber grew quiet and the night shift took over, Jake prepared to test his theory. The galaxy's greatest minds had spent over 2,000 years trying to solve the Velthran Codex through pure mathematics and advanced technology. Maybe it was time to try a simpler approach. Maybe it was time to think like a human instead of trying to think like a super-advanced alien civilization. Jake opened his notebook to a fresh page and began to sketch a new diagram. This one wasn't of the Codex's mathematical patterns. It was a simple drawing of a lock and key. Sometimes the simplest solutions were the right ones. The research chamber was almost empty during the night shift. Only a few researchers remained, mostly from species that didn't need sleep the way humans did. The Centauri representative, Flux 7, continued his endless calculations, his liquid metal form shifting and flowing as he worked. Two nethec crystals hummed quietly in their corner, maintaining their connection to the collective mind. Jake and Elena sat in the observation area, drinking coffee from Elena's personal supply. The Codex floated before them, its patterns somehow more peaceful in the quieter environment. The chaotic swirl of mathematical symbols had slowed to a gentle dance of lights and energy. "It really does look different at night," Elena observed. "Less active somehow." Jake nodded, flipping through his notebook. "I think all the attention during the day creates interference, like too many people trying to tune the same radio at, once." He had been studying his drawings for the past hour, comparing them to what he saw in the Codex. The pattern he had identified 3 days ago was clearer now. What everyone else saw as a complex mathematical node, Jake saw as something much simpler. "Elena, look at this section here." He pointed to a cluster of energy patterns near the edge of the Codex. "Everyone thinks this is part of the equation because it's connected to the main structure. But look at how it's connected." Elena studied the area he indicated. The energy flows from that section didn't feed into the central calculations. Instead, they seemed to wrap around the outside of the entire structure like a boundary or frame. "It's not part of the puzzle," she realized. "It's holding the puzzle together." "Exactly. Like the frame of Emma's puzzle box. You don't solve the frame. You use it to unlock what's inside." Jake stood up and walked closer to the Codex. The night shift researchers glanced at him but didn't interrupt their work. Humans were still a curiosity in galactic society, but they had earned enough respect that their strange behaviors were tolerated. "What are you thinking of doing?" Elena asked, following him. "Something that no one has tried in over 2,000 years, Jake replied. "I'm going to touch it." The statement caught the attention of the night shift researchers. Flux 7's liquid form stopped flowing for a moment, which was the equivalent of stopping mid-sentence in surprise. "The Codex is not designed for physical interaction," Flux 7 said, his voice like the sound of water flowing over metal. "It is a holographic projection of quantum energy patterns." "But it's stable energy," Jake replied. "And energy can be manipulated if you know where to apply pressure." The nethec crystals in the corner began humming more loudly, sharing rapid thoughts with their collective. One of them, Crystal Singer Harmonic Resonance, approached Jake with careful steps. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice like wind chimes, "the Codex has been studied by touch-based species before. The Growth-Act builders, who communicate through physical manipulation of objects, spent 50 years trying to solve it through tactile methods. They found no success." Jake smiled. "But did they touch the right part?" He pointed to the section he had identified in his drawings. "This node here, the one that looks like decoration. Has anyone ever specifically tried manipulating just this one piece?" The night shift researchers exchanged glances. In over 2,000 years of study, countless approaches had been tried. But Jake was asking about something very specific, The peripheral nodes have been dismissed as non-functional, Flux 7 admitted. They show no mathematical relationship to the central puzzle structure. That's exactly why I want to try touching it, Jake said. Emma's puzzle box had decorative elements too, but one of them was actually the key to the whole thing. Elena moved to stand beside him. Are you sure about this, Jake? What if touching it damages the codex somehow? Then we'll know it was more fragile than everyone thought, Jake replied. But I don't think it is. This thing has been sitting here for over 2,000 years, being studied and scanned and analyzed. If it was going to break, it would have happened already. Jake approached the codex slowly. Up close, the energy patterns were even more beautiful. Streams of golden light flowed like liquid electricity through pathways of crystallized space. The mathematical symbols that floated around it seemed to pulse with their own inner life. The peripheral node he had identified was about the size of a baseball, glowing with soft blue light. It connected to the main structure through thin streams of energy, but those connections looked different from the others. They were more like anchor points than data pathways. Jake reached out slowly, his hand approaching the glowing node. He could feel the energy in the air around it, like the static charge before a thunderstorm. The other researchers watched in fascination and concern. Here goes nothing, Jake murmured, and pressed his finger against the node. The moment his skin made contact with the energy field, everything changed. The node flashed from blue to brilliant amber, and the change rippled outward through the entire codex. Streams of energy that had been flowing in complex patterns suddenly simplified, forming straight lines and basic geometric shapes. Mathematical equations that had puzzled the galaxy's greatest minds for millennia collapsed into simple addition and subtraction. Alarms began sounding throughout the research chamber. Emergency lights flashed as the station's sensors detected massive energy fluctuations from the codex. But after a few seconds of chaos, everything stabilized. The codex still floated in the center of the room, but it was different now. About 30% of its complexity had simply vanished. What remained was still complex, but noticeably simpler than before. Impossible, whispered Flux 7, his form rippling with shock. Crystal Singer harmonic resonance was pulsing so rapidly, with light that her thoughts must have been flying across the galaxy to her collective, faster than normal space communication. The station's alert system continued to chime as emergency teams rushed toward the research chamber. Captain Amy Foster burst through the main entrance, followed by Ambassador Chen and a team of security officers. What happened? The entire station felt that energy surge. Jake was staring at the transformed codex in amazement. I think I just turned the first key, he said quietly. Key? Amy demanded. What key? Elena answered for him, her voice filled with excitement. Jake's been thinking about this all wrong, we all have. The codex isn't a puzzle to solve. It's a lock with multiple tumblers. Jake just activated the first one. More researchers were arriving, drawn by the alarms and the news that something had actually changed with the codex. The day shift was being called in early, and word was spreading throughout the station faster than official communications could travel. High calculator. Fourth 9 Ascending arrived with a team of Zephyrian mathematicians, their 6 arms already working at portable calculation devices. The energy patterns have fundamentally shifted, he announced. Mathematical relationships that were impossible to trace are now clearly visible. Jake looked at his notebook, then at the simplified codex, then back at his drawings. I think there are 3 locks total, he said. This was just the first one. How can you tell? Elena asked. Jake pointed to his sketches. Because now I can see the pattern more clearly. There are 2 more nodes that look like decoration but aren't, connected to the main mathematical structure. They're anchor points just like the one I touched. Ambassador Chen approached Jake with a mixture of admiration and concern. Dr. Morrison, what you've just done will change galactic history. But I need you to be very careful about what you do next. Every action you take is being recorded and analyzed by hundreds of civilizations. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility. But he also understood something else now. The Velthrans hadn't created an impossible mathematical puzzle. They had created a very clever lock that was disguised as an impossible mathematical puzzle. I want to find the second key, Jake said. But first, let me study how the codex has changed. I need to understand what unlocking the first part actually did. As the research chamber filled with excited scientists from across the galaxy, Jake sat back down with his notebook and began sketching the new patterns. Emma would have been proud of him, he thought. He had found the first hidden switch in the galaxy's most complex puzzle box. Now he just had to find the other two. News of Jake's success spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed messages could travel. Within hours of the first lock being opened, ships began arriving at Research Station Omega, carrying some of the most brilliant minds from hundreds of civilizations. The station's docking bays filled with vessels of every shape and size imaginable. Jake tried to ignore the attention and focus on studying the transformed codex. With the first layer simplified, he could see the underlying structure much more clearly. It was like looking at a machine after someone had removed the decorative covering. The mathematical relationships are now clearly visible in sections that were previously incomprehensible, reported Elder Melodious Truth Seeker of the Alterans. Her song-like voice carried notes of amazement that Jake had never heard from her before. We can trace energy pathways that were completely hidden yesterday. Jake nodded politely, but kept his attention on his notebook. He was sketching the new patterns, looking for the second and third locks. The first success had proven his theory, but it had also made his job harder. Now everyone was watching his every move. "Dr. Morrison," said a voice behind him. Jake turned to see Fleet Admiral Corax of the Hegemony Council, a massive being whose species looked like walking trees made of metal and crystal. "The Council requests a full briefing on your methodology." "My methodology is pretty simple," Jake replied. "I look at it and try to figure out how it works." Admiral Corax's crystalline branches chimed with what might have been laughter. "Surely there is more to it than that. You solved in 4 days what we could not solve in over 2 millennia. Elena, who had been quietly observing the crowds of researchers, moved closer to Jake. "Maybe that's exactly the point," she said. "You didn't spend 2,000 years convincing yourselves it was impossible." Jake appreciated Elena's support, but he could feel the pressure building. Every species in the galaxy wanted to understand how he had succeeded where they had failed. The problem was, he wasn't sure he could explain it in terms they would understand. "Admiral," Jake said carefully, "imagine you have a door that's painted to look like a complex piece of art. For 2,000 years, people have been trying to understand the meaning of the art. But it's not art, it's just a door. Once you realize that, you stop trying to interpret the painting and start looking for the handle." The Admiral's branches swayed as he processed this analogy. "You are saying we have been solving the wrong problem." "I'm saying you've been trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. The codex isn't a mathematical puzzle. It's a lock with 3 tumblers, and each tumbler is disguised as something else." Jake turned back to the codex and pointed to a section that was now clearly visible after the first simplification. "There's the second lock. See how this node cluster is connected to the structure? It's not part of the calculation, it's another anchor point. But this second lock was different from the first. Where the first had been a simple node that responded to touch, this one looked more complex. It appeared to be a sequence of connected energy points that needed to be activated in a specific order. "It's like a combination lock," Jake said to Elena. "But instead of numbers, it uses energy patterns." High Calculator Vorth 9 Ascending approached with his team of mathematicians. "We have analyzed the energy sequences required to activate the pattern. The mathematical complexity suggests over 14 million possible combinations." Jake shook his head. "You're thinking about it wrong again. This isn't about calculating the right combination. It's about finding the pattern the Felthrans actually used." He sat down and began sketching again, this time focusing on the sequence lock. The energy points were arranged in a spiral pattern, and each point glowed with a different intensity. But as Jake studied them, he began to see something familiar. "Elena, does this remind you of anything?" he asked, showing her his sketch. Elena studied the drawing. "It looks like a sequence of some kind, maybe based on a mathematical progression." "That's what I thought at first. But look at the intervals between the energy levels. They're not random and they're not based on any complex mathematics, they're based on prime numbers. Jake had always been good with prime numbers. They were some of the most basic concepts in mathematics, numbers that could only be divided by themselves and one. Every civilization that developed mathematics discovered prime numbers. But here's the interesting part, Jake continued. They're not in ascending order. They're in reverse order. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, but backwards. He approached the second lock and began touching the energy points in the sequence he had identified. Each touch caused the point to flare brighter, and when he completed the sequence in reverse order, the entire section of the codex transformed. Another 30% of the complexity vanished. Streams of energy that had been flowing in chaotic patterns suddenly organized themselves into clean, simple pathways. Mathematical equations that had seemed impossible became basic formulas that any first-year engineering student could understand. The research chamber erupted in excited voices as scientists from dozens of species began analyzing the new changes, but Jake was already looking for the third and final lock. There, he said, pointing to a section near the core of the codex. That's the last one. This final lock was different from the first two. It wasn't a simple node or a sequence pattern. Instead, it appeared to be asking for some kind of input, a mathematical value or formula that would complete the unlocking process. Jake studied it carefully, sketching the energy patterns in his notebook. The other researchers gathered around him, their excitement building as they realized he was about to attempt the final unlock. The pattern suggests it requires a specific mathematical constant, observed Flux 7, perhaps pi, or the gravitational constant, or Planck's constant. Maybe, Jake said. But remember, this whole thing has been simpler than everyone expected. What if the Velthrons use something basic? He thought about what he knew of the Velthrons from the archaeological records. They had been an advanced civilization, but not impossibly so. They had developed faster than light travel, but they had also left behind art and architecture that suggested they thought about beauty and harmony in ways that weren't entirely different from humans. Elena, what mathematical constant shows up in nature most often? Something that any civilization would discover just by observing the world around them? Elena thought for a moment. The golden ratio. It appears in flower petals, shell spirals, human proportions, galaxy formations. It's everywhere. Jake nodded. The golden ratio was one of those numbers that seemed to be built into the structure of reality itself. Any species that developed mathematics and studied nature would eventually discover it. He approached the final lock and began inputting the golden ratio using the energy interface. As he entered each digit, the corresponding section of the codex responded with pulses of light. The moment he completed the sequence, the entire codex dissolved. The massive, complex structure that had floated in the center of the research chamber for over 2,000 years simply vanished, replaced by a single elegant equation floating in the air where the codex had been. The equation was beautiful in its simplicity. It described a method for faster-than-light travel that avoided all the problems that had plagued galactic civilization. No space-time damage, no dangerous energy buildups, no limitations on usage time. It was perfect. The research chamber fell, completely silent as hundreds of the galaxy's greatest minds stared at the equation. After millennia of complexity and confusion, the answer turned out to be simple enough that Jake could write it in his notebook with a pencil. "How?" whispered Admiral Corax. "How did you know?" Jake looked at his notebook, then at the simple equation floating in the air, then at all the amazed faces around him. "Because I remembered something my daughter taught me a long time ago. Sometimes, the hardest problems have the simplest solutions. You just have to be willing to try the simple approach instead of assuming everything has to be complicated." He closed his notebook and smiled. The Velthrons weren't trying to create an impossible puzzle. They were trying to hide their discovery from anyone who would use it carelessly. They made it look impossible so that only someone who approached it with patience and simplicity could unlock it. Elena laughed, and the sound seemed to break the spell of amazement that had settled over the room. So the greatest mystery in galactic history was solved by thinking like a human instead of thinking like a super-advanced alien. Pretty much, Jake replied, though I had a lot of help from Emma's puzzle boxes. As the researchers began the long process of studying and understanding the revealed equation, Jake sat back in his chair and thought about calling his daughter. She would get a kick out of knowing that her childhood toys had helped solve the galaxy's greatest mystery. Sometimes, the best solutions really were the simplest ones. 3 weeks after Jake solved the Velthran Codex, Research Station Omega had become the busiest place in the galaxy. Ships arrived daily, bringing teams of engineers and scientists eager to study the equation that would revolutionize faster-than-light travel. The simple formula that had replaced the complex puzzle was already being called the most important discovery in galactic history. Jake sat in the station's observation lounge, watching the constant stream of ships through the large windows. He held a tablet displaying a video message from his daughter Emma, who was calling from her engineering station on Mars. "Dad, I still can't believe it," Emma was saying on the recording. "My silly puzzle boxes helped you solve the greatest mystery in the galaxy?" Mom would have laughed so hard at that. Jake smiled, remembering his wife Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago. She had always said that the best engineers were the ones who never forgot how to play with toys. Maybe she had been right about more things than he realized. Dr. Morrison? Jake looked up to see Ambassador Chen approaching with a formal-looking document in her hands. "The Galactic Council has reached a decision about Earth's status in the galactic community." Jake set down his tablet. "What kind of decision?" "Full membership," Chen said with a smile. "Not provisional membership, not associate status. Full membership with all the rights and privileges that come with it. And they're offering you a permanent position as Director of Unconventional Problem Solving." "Director of what now?" Chen laughed. "It's a new position they created just for you. Apparently the Council has been sitting on a collection of impossible problems for centuries. Things that their greatest minds couldn't solve. They want to send them all to Earth to see what human creativity can do with them." Jake shook his head in amazement. 3 weeks ago, most of them thought we were primitive newcomers. 3 weeks ago, they hadn't seen what human thinking could accomplish, Chen replied. "Your success with the Codex has changed how the galaxy sees us. More importantly, it's changed how the galaxy thinks about problem-solving itself." Through the lounge windows, Jake could see teams of alien engineers working on prototype ships equipped with the new FTL drive. The Zephyrians had been the first to build a test vessel, and their initial trials had exceeded all expectations. The new drive was not only more efficient than existing FTL technology, it actually healed the damage that previous drives had caused to spacetime. "Has anyone figured out why the Velthrans hid the equation in such a complex way?" Jake asked. "That's another interesting development," Chen said. "The archaeological teams have been re-examining Velthran ruins with new eyes. They're finding evidence that the Velthrans went through a period of rapid technological advancement, followed by some kind of philosophical transformation." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What kind of transformation?" "They seem to have decided that advanced technology should only be available to civilizations that had developed wisdom along with intelligence. The Codex wasn't just a hiding place for the FTL equation. It was a test." "A test of what?" "Patience, humility, and the willingness to try simple solutions instead of complex ones. Basically, it was a test to see if a species could resist the urge to overthink everything." Jake laughed. "So they created a test that only someone willing to think simply could pass." "Exactly, and humanity was the first species to pass it." Elena Rodriguez joined them in the lounge, carrying her ever-present cup of coffee. "Jake, you need to see what they're calling you in the galactic news feeds." She handed him another tablet. The screen showed news reports from dozens of different worlds, all featuring the same story. The headlines were translated into various languages, but they all said essentially the same thing. Human solves impossible puzzle, and the species that thinks differently. "My personal favorite is from the Alteran News Network," Elena said. "Ancient wisdom unlocked by primitive thinking." "Primitive thinking?" Jake asked, not sure if he should be offended. "They mean it as a compliment," Elena explained. "The Alterans are so advanced that they've forgotten how to think simply. To them, Primitive thinking is a lost art that they admire. Jake scrolled through more of the news reports. One article particularly caught his attention. It was an interview with High Calculator Vorth 9 Ascending, discussing what the Zephyrians had learned from observing human problem-solving methods. The humans approach problems from a fundamentally different perspective, the Zephyrian was quoted as saying. Where we see complexity and attempt to match it with complex solutions, they see complexity and ask whether it needs to be complex at all. This is not a limitation of their thinking. It is a strength we had not recognized. Another article featured Crystal Singer harmonic resonance from the Nethek Collective. Our collective consciousness allows us to process vast amounts of information simultaneously, but it also creates pressure to find solutions that match the complexity of our thoughts. The human Dr. Morrison succeeded because he was willing to ignore the complexity and focus on the simple truth beneath it. Jake set down the tablet and looked back out at the busy space traffic around the station. You know what the strangest part is? I don't feel like I did anything special. I just looked at the problem and tried to figure out how it worked. That's exactly what made it special, Chen replied. Every other species approached the codex as if it was a mathematical theorem to be proven. You approached it as if it was a machine to be understood. The difference in perspective made all the difference in results. Captain Amy Foster's voice came over the station's communication system. Dr. Morrison, please report to Docking Bay 12. The USS Horizon's Edge is prepared for departure. Jake gathered his things, including his simple notebook and pencil, that had become famous throughout the galaxy. As they walked toward the docking bay, he noticed that the alien researchers they passed looked at him differently now. Instead of the polite curiosity he had experienced when he arrived, there was genuine respect and interest. Dr. Morrison called Fleet Admiral Corax as they passed the main research chamber. Before you depart, the Council has a request. Jake stopped and waited as the massive tree-like being approached. What can I do for you, Admiral? We would like you to establish a human-led research facility, Corax said. A place where problems that have stumped our conventional approaches can be studied using human methodologies. Would you consider such a position? Jake thought about it. The offer was flattering, but he also thought about Earth, about his daughter Emma, about the life he had built there. Can I think about it? Of course, but know that the galaxy is eager to learn more about human creativity and unconventional thinking. Your success has opened doors that we did not even know existed. As they continued toward the docking bay, Elena asked, "Are you seriously considering staying out here?" "I'm considering a lot of things," Jake replied. "But first I want to go home and tell Emma about her puzzle boxes becoming galactically famous. She's never going to believe it." They boarded the Horizon's Edge and Jake took one last look at Research Station Omega through the shuttle's windows. The station was still busy with ships and researchers, all working to understand and implement the technology that had been hidden in the Velthran Codex. As their ship prepared to jump to faster-than-light speed using the new drive system, Jake opened his notebook and began sketching again. Ambassador Chen had mentioned that the Galactic Council had other impossible problems waiting to be solved. Maybe it was time to introduce the galaxy to more examples of human thinking. After all, Emma had owned dozens of different puzzle boxes, and each one had taught him something different about finding simple solutions to complex problems. The jump to FTL engaged, and Jake felt the smooth transition that the new drive system provided. No violent shaking, no dangerous energy buildups, no damage to space-time. Just a gentle shift from normal space to faster-than-light travel, as easy as opening a door. Jake smiled and continued sketching in his notebook. Sometimes the best solutions really were the simplest ones, and humans seemed to be naturally good at remembering that fact. Maybe that would be their contribution to galactic civilization. Not advanced technology or superior intelligence, but the wisdom to try the simple approach first. As the Horizon's Edge raced toward Earth at speeds that would have been impossible, just a month ago, Jake began planning what he would say when the galaxy's next impossible problem arrived on his desk. He had a feeling there would be many more puzzles waiting to be unlocked, and humanity was just getting started. The galaxy had learned something important from watching a human solve their greatest mystery. Sometimes the most sophisticated civilizations needed to remember how to think like children playing with puzzle boxes, and humanity, it seemed, had never forgotten how to play.